Stay with me. Because the moment he dropped to his knees, the entire courtroom realized the wrong woman had been underestimated. The sound wasn't loud, not really, but it cut through the silence like something heavier than noise, something final, something that couldn't be taken back. Daniel Whitmore, the man whose name once opened doors from Manhattan penthouses to Silicon Valley boardrooms, stood frozen for half a second too long before lowering himself down, one knee brushing against the polished wood floor as if gravity itself had turned against him. His suit, custom-tailored, charcoal gray, worth more than most people's monthly rent, creased at the wrong angle, imperfect, human. Cameras didn't flash. No one moved. Even the judge's pen stopped midair. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not in the room. In him. Because across from him, seated quietly with her hands folded, was Emily Carter. 7 months ago, she had walked into a hospital parking structure alone, her hand resting gently on a life growing inside her, her world already cracking in ways she hadn't yet named. Tonight, she didn't look at Daniel with anger. She didn't look at him with sadness. She barely looked at him at all. And somehow, that was worse. People would later say they felt it. That moment when power changes hands without a word spoken. 20 million viewers would call it the quietest collapse ever recorded. But in that room, it wasn't a spectacle. It was a reckoning. Daniel's voice finally broke the silence. Low, controlled. The same voice that had once negotiated multi-million-dollar deals in under 10 minutes. Emily, we don't have to do this. The words sounded rehearsed, like something practiced in a mirror that no longer reflected the same man. She didn't answer. Not immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering a question no one else could hear. Her expression remained still, composed, untouched by the tension suffocating the air. The kind of stillness that isn't weakness, but decision. And that's when the judge leaned forward, placing the document flat against the bench with a soft, deliberate motion that echoed louder than any shout could have. Paper, ink, evidence. Things Daniel had spent a lifetime controlling. Things he no longer could. Outside, somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, traffic moved as usual. Yellow cabs honked. People checked their phones. Coffee orders were called out in crowded shops. The world hadn't stopped. But inside that room, time folded in on itself. Because what no one in that courtroom knew, what Daniel certainly didn't know, was that this moment had been set in motion long before he ever realized he was losing. Long before the silence. Long before the fall. It started on a night that smelled like rain on concrete, under flickering overhead lights, when a woman chose not to scream. And that choice changed everything. The rain had already started by the time Emily Carter stepped out of the elevator, a soft, steady rhythm tapping against the concrete levels of the parking structure like a quiet warning no one else seemed to hear. And for a moment she stood there without moving, one hand resting lightly against her coat, feeling the subtle, reassuring movement beneath it. A reminder that she was not alone even if everything else in her life had begun to feel that way, because just hours earlier she had been sitting at a dining table set for two in a high-rise apartment overlooking the Hudson River, watching the steam from her untouched tea curl into the air while her phone lit up with a notification she was not meant to see. A photo, tagged publicly. Daniel Whitmore smiling beside Vanessa Blake under the golden lights of a private rooftop event, his hand resting in a way that did not belong to a business conversation. His expression relaxed in a way she had not seen in months, and the caption had been simple, almost careless. Some nights are worth celebrating. As if $20 million in contracts and a wife waiting at home were details too small to mention, and Emily had not cried then. Not when the realization settled into her chest with a weight that made it difficult to breathe. Not when she scrolled further and saw comments from people who assumed she no longer existed. She had simply placed the phone face down and sat there, listening to the clock on the wall mark. Each second with quiet precision, because something inside her had already begun to shift, something that did not feel like heartbreak, but like clarity. And now, standing in that dimly lit structure with fluorescent lights flickering overhead, she took a slow breath and moved forward, her steps careful but steady, her shoes echoing softly against the concrete floor, the air carrying the faint scent of oil and rain and something colder beneath it. The kind of place people passed through without noticing, the kind of place where moments happened without witnesses, And she remembered the last conversation she had tried to have with Daniel just 3 nights earlier, his voice distant, distracted, explaining delays, meetings, obligations, words that sounded rehearsed even then. And she had nodded because it was easier than asking questions that would not be answered. Easier than admitting that the life she had built around him was no longer something he intended to protect. And as she reached her car, her reflection briefly caught in the dark window. She paused, studying the woman looking back at her, the slight curve of her shoulders, the quiet strength in her eyes that had gone unnoticed for far too long. And it was in that moment that her phone vibrated again, not with a message this time, but with a call, a name she had not seen in months, Michael Carter. And for a second her fingers hovered over the screen, because calling him meant acknowledging that something was wrong, that the version of her life she had been holding on to was already gone. And the rain grew heavier, tapping faster, louder, filling the silence around her until it felt like the world was urging her to decide. And when she finally answered, she did not say hello right away. She simply listened to the sound of his breathing on the other end, steady, familiar, grounding. And when she spoke, her voice was calm in a way that surprised even her. "I think I need you." And there was no hesitation in his response, no questions, no doubt, just a quiet certainty that carried more weight than anything Daniel had said in weeks. "Tell me where you are." And as Emily looked around the empty structure, at the shadows stretching across the floor and the rain tracing slow lines down the concrete pillars, she realized that this was the moment everything began to change. Not with a confrontation, not with anger, but with a decision made in silence, a choice to stop pretending that what was breaking could still be fixed. And somewhere far above, in a world of glass towers and polished deals, Daniel Whitmore continued his evening as if nothing had shifted at all, unaware that the ground beneath him had already started to give way. Michael Carter arrived in less than 10 minutes, though later Emily would not remember hearing the engine or seeing the headlights approach. Only the sudden presence of him stepping out of the truck with the same quiet urgency he had carried since they were children, his eyes scanning the space once, twice, taking in everything without asking a single unnecessary question, because that was who he had always been, the one who noticed what others ignored, the one who stepped in before things fell too far. And when he reached her, he did not reach for her right away. He simply stood close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him. The kind of steadiness that did not break under pressure. And for a second, the only sound between them was the rain hitting the concrete in uneven rhythms, echoing through the empty structure like a heartbeat that refused to settle. "You are safe," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, not asking what happened, not demanding answers, just stating something she had not realized she needed to hear. And Emily nodded, even though nothing about her life felt safe anymore. Not the apartment, not the marriage, not the carefully constructed world that now felt like a stage set about to collapse. And as she leaned lightly against the side of her car, she realized her hands were colder than she expected, her breath slower, more deliberate, as if her body had already begun adjusting to a new reality before her mind had caught up. "I saw something tonight," she said, her voice steady, each word placed carefully, and Michael did not interrupt, did not fill the silence. He simply listened, because he understood that sometimes the truth needed space before it could be spoken. And she told him about the photo, about the nights Daniel had been distant, about the conversations that no longer made sense when you looked at them closely. And when she finished, there was no dramatic reaction, no sudden anger, just a quiet shift in Michael's expression, something tightening slightly around his eyes, as if he had already started calculating what came next. "How long have you known?" he asked, not accusing, not surprised, just confirming. And Emily thought about it for a moment, about all the small signs she had ignored, the late meetings, the distracted tone, the way Daniel had stopped asking about her appointments, about the baby, about anything that required him to be present. "Long enough," she answered, and the words hung there between them, heavier than they sounded, because they meant more than time. They meant awareness. They meant she had crossed a line internally that she could not step back from. And Michael nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if that was all he needed to hear. "Then we do this right," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made the air feel different, not lighter, not easier, but clearer, like a path had just been drawn where there had only been confusion before. and Emily looked at him then. Really looked, noticing the details she had not paid attention to in months, the calm in his posture, the way his presence seemed to anchor the space around him. And she realized that whatever came next would not be chaotic, would not be reactive. It would be controlled, precise, intentional. And for the first time that night, she felt something other than uncertainty, not relief, not yet, but direction. And as Michael opened the passenger door of his truck and gestured for her to get in, he paused just long enough to say one more thing, quieter this time, almost as if he was saying it for himself as much as for her. People like him only fall when they believe they cannot. And Emily did not respond. She simply stepped forward, settling into the seat, her hand resting once more over the quiet, steady reminder beneath her coat. And as the truck pulled out into the rain, merging onto a road that stretched into the night, somewhere across the city, Daniel Whitmore raised a glass under warm lights, smiling at conversations that did not matter, completely unaware that every step he took from this moment on was leading him exactly where he did not want to go. The city looked different from the passenger seat. Or maybe Emily was seeing it for the first time without the filter she had been holding on to for years. The glass towers no longer symbols of success, but structures filled with decisions she had never been allowed to question. And as Michael drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, the windshield wipers moving in a slow, consistent rhythm, she realized that the quiet between them was not empty. It was deliberate, giving her space to think without pressure, without interruption. And that alone felt unfamiliar, because in her life with Daniel, silence had always carried expectation, a demand to fill it, to explain, to justify. But now there was none of that. Only the soft hum of the engine and the steady fall of rain tracing lines across the glass. And after several minutes, Michael turned onto a side street lined with older buildings. Brick facades worn but solid, the kind of place that did not rely on appearance to prove its value. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was the same measured tone, calm but precise. "We do not confront him yet," he said, not as a suggestion but as a strategy already decided. And Emily nodded without hesitation, because something inside her had already aligned with that instinct, the understanding that reacting now would only give Daniel the advantage he was used to having, the ability to control the narrative, to redirect attention, to minimize what mattered, and she was no longer willing to play that role. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice steady, stronger than it had been earlier. And Michael slowed the truck as they approached a small building with a discreet sign near the door, one that did not advertise loudly, but suggested purpose to those who knew how to read it. And he parked before turning to look at her fully for the first time since arriving, his expression focused, intent. "We listen," he said, and the word carried more weight than it seemed, because it meant patience, observation, gathering what had been hidden in plain sight. And as Emily stepped out of the truck, the rain had softened into a light mist, the air cooler, clearer, and inside the building the lighting was warm but subdued, a contrast to the sharp brightness of the spaces she had grown used to. And a woman in her early 40s looked up from behind a desk, her posture composed, her gaze direct, the kind of presence that suggested she understood situations before they were explained. "You are late," she said to Michael without looking surprised, and he gave a slight nod. "It became necessary," he replied, and Emily realized then that this meeting had not been arranged in the moment. It had been prepared, anticipated, as if Michael had been expecting this call long before it came. And something about that realization made her pause, not out of fear, but awareness that the situation she had stepped into was larger than a single night, larger than a single betrayal. And the woman gestured toward a chair, her attention shifting to Emily with a measured calm. "You can sit," she said, her tone neither gentle nor harsh, simply factual. And as Emily lowered herself into the chair, she noticed the file placed neatly on the desk, her name printed clearly across the top. And her breath slowed, not because she was afraid, but because she understood, truly understood, that this was no longer about discovering what had happened. It was about uncovering everything that had been deliberately concealed. And across the city, under lights that made everything appear effortless, Daniel Whitmore continued his evening as planned, unaware that somewhere else, in a quiet room he would never have noticed, The first pieces of his world were already being arranged into something he would not be able to control. The woman did not introduce herself right away, and somehow that made everything feel more intentional, as if names were not the priority here, only truth. And she opened the file slowly, turning it so that Emily could see the first page, neat columns of numbers, dates, and account identifiers that meant nothing at a glance but carried weight in the way they were organized, precise, deliberate, impossible to ignore once understood, and Emily felt her fingers tighten slightly against the arm of the chair as her eyes moved across the page, recognizing Daniel's name not once but repeatedly, attached to accounts she had never seen, transfers she had never questioned, patterns that did not belong to the version of him she had believed in. These are not recent, the woman said, her voice even, measured, as if she had explained this many times before. Some of these go back 3 years, and the words landed quietly but firmly, because 3 years meant before the distance, before the late nights, before the small cracks had appeared in ways Emily could identify, which meant the truth had never been new, only hidden well enough to remain unquestioned. And Michael remained standing near the door, arms crossed loosely, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly, but present in a way that grounded the room. He structured them carefully. The woman continued, turning another page, layered ownership, third-party holdings, offshore routing, all legal on the surface, but designed to avoid visibility. And Emily let out a slow breath she did not realize she had been holding, because this was not just betrayal in the way she had understood it before, not just emotional distance or misplaced loyalty. It was planning, it was intention, it was a version of Daniel that had existed alongside her life without her ever seeing it clearly. And her gaze dropped briefly to the lower corner of the page where a date stood out, one she recognized instantly. The same week they had celebrated a milestone. The same week he had promised her stability, security, a future that now felt constructed from something far less honest. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Not because she did not understand its importance, but because she needed to. Hear it said out loud, and the woman closed the file halfway, her eyes steady on Emily. "Because you are still listed as a dependent beneficiary on several of these structures," she said, and that single sentence shifted everything again, because it meant she was not outside of this system. She was inside it, connected in ways she had never agreed to, her name attached to decisions she had never made. And for a moment the room felt smaller, not suffocating, but focused, like everything unnecessary had been removed, leaving only what mattered. If he moves assets now, if he changes the structure, you lose visibility, the woman added, and Michael finally stepped forward slightly, his voice calm, but firm, "which is why we do not let him know we are aware," he said, and Emily looked between them, understanding settling in not as fear, but as clarity, because this was no longer about reacting to what had already happened. It was about controlling what came next, about making sure that when the truth surfaced, it would do so completely, without gaps, without room for denial. And as she straightened slightly in her seat, her hand once again resting over the quiet presence beneath her coat, she felt something steady return, not the life she had before, but something stronger, something built on awareness instead of assumption. And across the city, under warm lights and easy laughter, Daniel Whitmore raised another glass, unaware that every number he had hidden, every detail he believed protected, was no longer invisible, and that the story he thought he controlled was already being rewritten without him. Emily did not reach for the file again right away, even though every instinct told her to keep reading, to absorb every detail, because something in her understood that information without strategy was just noise, and she had spent too long living in a space where noise disguised truth. So instead she leaned back slightly, her gaze steady, her breathing controlled, allowing the silence in the room to stretch just long enough for the weight of what she had seen to settle into something usable, something structured. And the woman across from her seemed to notice that shift, the subtle difference between someone reacting and someone deciding, because she closed the file completely this time and rested her hand on top of it, as if marking a boundary. "There is more," she. Connection, more than coincidence, and Emily's fingers stilled for just a moment before continuing, because that name was no longer just a symbol of betrayal. It was part of something larger, something deliberate, and she closed the folder gently, her expression unchanged but her posture different, more grounded, more certain, and when she looked up, her voice carried a quiet resolve that had not been there before. "Tell me what comes next," she said, and neither Michael nor the woman hesitated. Because this was the point where understanding turned into action, where the plan began to take shape not as reaction but as design, and outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the air still, almost expectant, as if the city itself had paused for a moment, unaware that within one quiet room, a different kind of movement had already begun, one that would not announce itself until it was far too late to stop. The plan did not begin with action, it began with restraint, and that was the part most people never understood, because the instinct to respond, to confront, to demand answers was strong, almost automatic, but Emily sat there without moving, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her breathing even, as Michael outlined the next steps with the same measured clarity he had carried since the moment he arrived. "We do nothing visible," he said, and the words felt counterintuitive at first, almost unnatural, yet the logic behind them was undeniable, because every move Daniel expected would only reinforce his control, every emotional reaction would confirm the version of Emily he believed still existed, and that was no longer the version sitting in that room. "He watches patterns," the woman added quietly, her eyes focused, analytical. "Changes draw attention, attention creates defense, and defense closes access." And Emily nodded slowly, absorbing the rhythm of that reasoning, understanding that silence was not passivity, it was positioning, and for the next hour the conversation moved with precision, details unfolding in layers, each piece connecting to the next with deliberate intent. Schedules were reviewed, not just Daniel's, but hers, identifying what needed to remain consistent, what could shift without notice, what spaces allowed observation without exposure. And it was not overwhelming. It was structured, a system designed to replace uncertainty with control, and as Emily listened, she began to see her own life differently, not as something that had happened to her, but as something she could now navigate with awareness, with choice. "There is an event in 3 days," Michael said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table, and Emily glanced down, recognizing the location immediately. A private corporate gathering Daniel had mentioned casually, framed as routine, insignificant, but the details on the page suggested otherwise. Attendees listed with precision, names connected to the very accounts she had just seen, and the realization settled quietly, not with shock, but with clarity, because this was not coincidence. This was alignment, an intersection of the personal and the concealed. "You will attend," Michael continued. And Emily's gaze lifted, steady, unshaken, because she already understood why, not to confront, not to expose, but to observe, to confirm what had been uncovered in a setting Daniel believed was controlled, predictable, safe. "He will not expect you to notice anything," the woman added, her tone calm, almost matter of fact. "That is your advantage." And Emily let those words settle, because advantage was not something she had associated with herself in a long time, not in this context, not in this relationship, and yet here it was, not given, but recognized, something she could use without announcing it. And as the meeting came to a close, there were no dramatic declarations, no final warnings, just a quiet understanding that everything moving forward would depend on precision, on timing, on the ability to remain unseen while seeing everything. And when Emily finally stood, her posture was different, not tense, not uncertain, but aligned with something stronger than emotion, something deliberate. And as she stepped back into the night air, the city felt unchanged on the surface, lights still glowing, traffic still moving, people still unaware, but for her, everything had shifted, not. Voice smooth, neutral, as if her presence required explanation, and Emily allowed a small, almost unremarkable smile. "You said it was important," she replied, her tone light, unthreatening, exactly as he anticipated, and for a moment, everything appeared normal, exactly as it should, exactly as he believed it to be, and that was the point, because while he continued speaking, explaining, maintaining the version of reality he had constructed, Emily's attention shifted just enough to take in the room behind him, the faces she had seen on the list, now positioned in patterns that matched what she had studied, connections aligning in real time, confirmations appearing without a single question being asked, and she moved through the evening with quiet precision, listening more than speaking, observing more than reacting, and at one point, as Daniel was briefly pulled into another conversation, she found herself near a small group discussing something in lowered tones, numbers mentioned, casually, references to transactions framed as routine, and none of it was obvious to anyone not paying attention. But she was paying attention now, every detail settling into place with the structure she had been given, and when Daniel returned to her side, nothing in her demeanor suggested that anything had changed, no tension, no confrontation, just the same calm presence he had always relied on. And that was what made it work, because as the evening continued, he remained unaware that every step he took, every conversation he entered, was being understood in a way it never had been before. And as the event began to wind down, Emily stepped outside for a moment, the night air cooler, quieter, the city stretching out in front of her in steady lights, and she placed her hand lightly over her coat, feeling the same quiet presence beneath it, grounding, constant. And when she looked back through the glass doors, Daniel was still inside, still moving through a world he believed he controlled, unaware that tonight had not been about appearance, not about attendance, but about confirmation, and that confirmation was now complete. The courtroom felt smaller than it should have, not because of its size, but because of what it held, the quiet tension settling into every corner like something waiting to be acknowledged. And Emily sat exactly where she had been instructed, her posture composed, her hands resting calmly, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but inevitably drew it, because across from her, everything that had once seemed untouchable was now being examined piece by piece, not with emotion, not with accusation, but with clarity. And Daniel stood there in a way no one in that room had ever seen before, not diminished, not yet, but no longer certain, his confidence measured now, his responses calculated in a way that suggested he was searching for ground that no longer existed beneath him. And the documents presented were not dramatic, they were simple, precise, each one placed with intention, timelines aligned, transactions explained, structures revealed in a way that did not rely on interpretation but on fact. And that was what made it impossible to redirect, because there was no narrative to control, only evidence to acknowledge. And Emily did not look at him when the first question was asked. She did not react when the connections were outlined. She remained exactly as she had been, because this moment was not about confrontation, it was about completion. And as the proceedings continued, the room shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. The subtle change in how people listened, how they observed, how they understood what was being shown to them. And Daniel's voice, when he spoke, carried less certainty each time, not because he did not know what to say, but because what he said no longer shaped the outcome. It only responded to it. And that was the difference, the shift from control to reaction, from certainty to awareness. And when the final document was placed before the judge, there was no dramatic pause, no raised voices, just a quiet stillness as everything aligned into something complete, something undeniable. And for a moment, no one moved, not because they were waiting, but because there was nothing left to question. And it was in that silence that Emily finally lifted her gaze, not quickly, not sharply, just enough to meet Daniel's eyes across the room. And there was no anger there, no satisfaction, only a calm understanding that what had been hidden was no longer invisible. And that was enough, because this had never been about taking something from him. It had been about no longer allowing something to be taken from her. And as the judge spoke, the words carried the weight of finality without needing emphasis. Decisions made not on emotion but on fact, outcomes determined by what had been proven. And Emily listened without reacting, because the result, while significant, was not the point. The point had already been reached long before this moment. In the quiet decision to see clearly, to act deliberately, to move without announcing it until everything was in place. And when it was over, she stood without hesitation, her movements unhurried, her presence unchanged, because nothing about her required validation from what had just occurred. And as she walked past Daniel without stopping, without a word, the space between them carried more meaning than anything that could have been said. And outside, the The city moved as it always did, unaware of the quiet collapse that had just taken place inside. Because some endings do not need noise to be complete, they only need truth to be seen. And in that moment, as Emily stepped into the open air, her hand resting lightly where it had been all along, she understood something that could not be undone, that strength does not always arrive loudly, and justice does not always demand attention. But when it comes, it leaves nothing unchanged, and somewhere behind her, in a room that no longer belonged to him, Daniel Whitmore remained standing, facing the outcome he never believed would reach him, learning too late that control built on silence does not survive when that silence finally breaks.